Hello, fellow humans. The following is a conversation with Dr. Fedorenko, cognitive neuroscientist at MIT and one of the world's leading researchers on how the brain processes language. In this episode, we explore the remarkable discovery that the brain's language network is functionally distinct, a specialized system that doesn't overlap with other forms of high-level thinking like math, music, or logic. We also talk about the practical impact of individual variability, what it means for understanding aphasia and recovery, and how this research challenges long-standing assumptions about Broca's and Wernicke's area, and even categories like syntax and semantics. And for clinicians, there's definitely a powerful takeaway. What we've traditionally called language in therapy or education might not exactly be what the brain's actual language system is doing. So what lies beyond the words we speak? Tune in and find out. Welcome to Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with speechtherapypd.com. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama. I'm a musician practicing SLP and a PhD student with an interest in all things language, music, and cognition. And I'm so excited that we have the one and only Dr. Ev Fedorenko blessing us with her presence today. Here's just a little bit more about Ev. So Dr. Fedorenko is an associate professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT and the principal investigator of the Language and Brain Lab at the McGovern Institute. Her research explores how the brain supports language processing and how it interacts with other cognitive systems like memory and attention. And using tools like fMRI and intracranial recordings, she has pioneered individualized brain mapping techniques that reveal a consistent selective language network across people. Her work has major implications for understanding language disorders, and she's also a leading voice in advancing open, collaborative science in cognitive neuroscience. Before we get started, we have a few items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. Just a couple of other disclosures. We receive some compensation from speech therapy PD for this podcast, but there's no other relevant non-financial disclosures to report. So without further ado, Dr. Fedorenko, welcome to Beyond Words.
Thanks, Garrett. Pleasure to be here.
So I always just ask the guests a little bit about their superhero origin story. What got you interested in this field of language?
Well, I always liked learning languages, but I didn't quite know about cognitive science as a field until I came to the US for my college education. I was admitted to Harvard College on a full scholarship and came in 98. And at that point, I took some classes which made me realize that you can kind of study how people represent and process language for a living. And I knew that's what I was going to do. And so, learning a bunch of languages early on was helpful to get some insights into certain things. But of course, the field goes way beyond just the multilingualism related questions. So, yeah.
Right. Very cool. So did you speak multiple languages growing up?
I used to living in the US makes it hard to maintain things, but I still I have passable French. I can get by, and there's a few other languages I can read, but can no longer really speak with any respectable fluency.
Got it. That's very cool. So I wanted to start with something that's really familiar to SLPs, but maybe a bit misunderstood, and something that you've helped to sort of disambiguate, but that's talking about Broca's and Wernicke's area. It's probably something I started with in like 15 of my grad school classes. They're like, Broca's aphasia, expressive language, Wernicke's aphasia, receptive language. And I just wanted to ask, what might be the subtle point that we're getting wrong here when we talk about these areas?
No, it's a great question. So I think there has been a lot of confusion historically in the field between speech and language. So the brief answer is that I think both Broca's and Wernicke's areas, as they were originally discovered and described by Broca and Wernicke, are actually not language areas, but lower level speech articulation and speech perception area respectively. And a big distinction between language and speech is that language is fundamentally amodal, right? So by the time our language brain areas process linguistic information, it doesn't matter if you're reading text or listening to it, or if you're a speaker of a sign language, if you're watching somebody sign you a message, by the time the information gets to the language system, it's fundamentally amodal. It's a sequence of words that you may have extracted from speech or from written language or from sign language or from tactile language. If you're deaf blind individual. In contrast, the speech areas, of course, are fundamentally linked to a particular modality. So speech perception and speech articulation are both tied to auditory spoken language processing, right? So if we're understanding language through the auditory modality, then before the information gets to the language interpretation system, it goes through a part of the auditory cortex that processes speech sounds, right? And those areas are very specific for speech sounds relative to other sounds, like your dog barking or a tractor noise or whatever, music, but they are not interpreting the signals. They're just processing kind of the sound features of the signal. And those areas will work just as much if you're listening to speech in a language that's totally unfamiliar to you, okay? So those areas don't care whether you can or cannot make sense of the signals. They just care about the acoustics of speech. And similarly, so that what I think is what Wernicke discovered through studies of patients with brain damage. And similarly, the frontal Broca's area is an area that supports speech motor articulatory planning. And in fact, if you read Broca's original description, he's very clear on this. He says it's not a language area. He says it's an area that selectively supports speech motor articulation. And again, you can engage that area if I just ask you to repeat some syllables that make no sense at all, right? They're just a sequence of speech units that you can plan and produce, but are not meaningful or structured in any sense. So I think that's a big distinction. Those are not language areas, they're speech areas. So they're language assisting.
Right. Yeah, so important because this is something I got wrong for so long. Like I'm embarrassed to admit, but yeah, I mean, even in grad school, when I was in grad school, it was like they're like, oh, expressive and receptive language. These are the areas for expressive and receptive language. But I guess the point here is that you can have these like sort of intact internal language structures or these abstract representations of language, but you could be unable to express them because of motor issues. And I mean, I suppose that also means that you can have those, you can be unable to express them because of deficits in those actual like language errors as well. But that would probably manifest in like, your ability to understand as well.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yep.
Cool. Yeah. And, I was wondering a little bit about this, expressive receptive distinction. One thing that I've enjoyed kind of going through your work is like pulling out all these distinctions that exist and seeing if they're instantiated in the brain. But in this expressive receptive distinction, are there different things going on in the higher level language centers when you're producing versus listening to language that you understand?
That's another good question. So I think a good way to think about what we call the language system, which is this amodal system of kind of knowledge and processing, is that it's effectively a system that stores our knowledge of the language, right? So, many people here have some familiarity with what it means to know a language, right? When you're learning a language, be it as an infant or as a second language learner in adulthood, you're learning the sounds of the language, how those sounds can go together. You're learning what words mean, and you're learning rules for how to combine words into phrases and sentences, right? So that knowledge has to be stored somewhere, right? And I think we now have good evidence to think that these amodal language areas is where that knowledge is stored. Now, if you think about it, that knowledge is essential to both interpret what somebody else is saying or writing and to produce it. Now, of course, the algorithms we would use for those two processes may well be different. And at that level, there's still a lot to understand how exactly the computations are instantiated within this tissue. But it seems like it's the very same areas that are engaged when we have to interpret somebody else's sequences of words or when we have to produce our own. So you can imagine that as you're listening to me speak, right? And after your speech area is done crunching the acoustics of the sounds and you've extracted the word sequence, what do we do when we understand language? We kind of look up in memory the meanings of individual words, and we're putting them together using our knowledge of the grammar, basically, or the syntax of the language, right? So that's how you're using your language system right now. And on my end, when I'm producing these grammatical, meaningful sentences. I have some idea I'm trying to express, and then I search the very same knowledge store of language to find the right words that express those ideas and put them together in ways that express these complex meanings. So I often talk about this language system as a kind of encoder-decoder system, right? We use it to both decode others' linguistic messages and encode our thoughts into sequences of words.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Maybe just to break it down for folks, it'd be helpful to know kind of what are all the brain areas that are involved in speech and language tasks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, can you localize us in the brain a little
Yeah.
bit?
Of course, yeah. So you already mentioned the lower level speech perception areas, which are sitting kind of at the top of your temporal lobe. They're, below the primary auditory areas, but still within the kind of auditory cortex. When you're processing written language, you're using a visual region on the bottom of your left temporal lobe, which is known as the visual word form area, which is an area that becomes specialized for recognizing letters or characters when you're learning to read. And then this is the area that presumably sends input to the language system when we're reading and understanding written material. The amodal language areas themselves are located on the side of the temporal lobe. So if you like take the skull away, you'll see the side of the temporal lobe. It kind of goes right along the center, along the superior temporal sulcus, middle temporal gyrus. And then there's also a couple of components in the frontal lobe, also on the side of the left frontal lobe. And these areas are strongly interconnected anatomically and functionally. And that's why we often call it the language network, because there's actually evidence to think that they are strongly interconnected. And there is some reasons to think that the posterior temporal part of the system may be more important,
Mm,
kind of the most important piece of this whole network, so that if you damage that piece, you end up with more severe and more longer lasting linguistic deficits, so kind of worse off aphasia. But in typical brains, during healthy processing, all these frontal and temporal areas are really working together as a kind of integrated system.
got it. So interesting. Yeah. I think you mentioned somewhere too that like polyglots, um, their processing is more restricted to this like posterior
That's
temporal
right.
region.
That's
Um,
exactly right. Yeah, yeah. They seem to be, at least for processing their native language, which is the condition for which we can compare them to typical individuals, right? Like, I don't know how many languages you speak, but let's say somebody just speaks one language or two languages, right? And say they're a native speaker of English, and take a polyglot who's a native speaker of English, but also is fluent in, say, 15 other languages, right? When they're processing their native language, polyglots processing appears to be more vocal. The language system is kind of smaller, and oftentimes it's really just the posterior temporal cortex that gets engaged, and they don't even need to recruit this whole system. So we don't know
that's
whether
cool.
they become more efficient by virtue of practicing kind of language learning and processing across these different languages, or perhaps these are the individuals who are born with extra efficient language processing
Mm,
mechanisms from early on, and that kind of makes them want to go and and they learn, maybe it's easier for them to learn languages throughout their lives or something like that.
yeah. Yeah. So cool. One thing your research also highlighted is sort of the modularity of the language network in the brain. That there isn't like kind of as previously thought there's not much else going on in these language in this language system, this network that you're talking about when we're engaged in language-based tasks, sort of suggesting that we're not really using language for thought. I was
Right.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about this because I think it's such a cool, like this is such a really paradigm
Yeah.
shifting finding.
Yeah, that was a surprise early on in our work, where there was this disconnect between the brain imaging literature and the patient evidence from aphasia, where uh, the patient studies have routinely reported cases of individuals who have these really apparently selective language deficits. Like, you can see that they're just as smart. If they could do all sorts of complex thinking stuff before, they can continue to do these tasks. And then when brain imaging methods became widespread, suddenly there was this flurry of claims that language overlaps with all sorts of other things. And those findings just didn't square with evidence of selective deficits in aphasia. And so one of the very first things I started working on back in like 2010 and before that is trying to basically systematically test these claims. And fMRI is a method that's limited in many ways. It has all sorts of imperfections as a tool, but one set of questions it's really good at answering is actually whether two bits of mental computations draw on the same underlying resources, right? So if you're able to design tasks, contrasts that target a particular mental a piece of your mental effort, you can say, okay, when you're doing math and when you're doing language, are you using the same bits of your brain, right? Do the same bits get engaged? Or when you're listening to music versus listening to meaningful language, do you use the same bits of your brain? So these kinds of questions. And so over the last bunch of years, we've compared responses to language with responses to many, many, many different kinds of tests. Many of them are, as you pointed out, kind of thinking, targeting tasks, right? So doing math or solving logic puzzles or, holding information active in working memory, which is a key piece of a lot of complex cognition. And some of them are some of these other kinds of tasks that have been hypothesized to overlap with language, like listening to music. Music is a very, richly structured stimulus, has a lot of hierarchical structure in it, which is also a core feature of language. Or some people have argued that language overlaps with kind of general perception of communicative information, right? Like processing facial expressions or gestures that we often use in conjunction with speech and so on. And empirically, it turns out that really the language, the regions that support language comprehension and production are really not engaged during any of those other kinds of processes. And I think a plausible reason for why people have drawn this conclusion incorrectly is because there is a lot of fine-grained spatial structure in the brain. And so a lot of the early work was using methods that would not allow you to see that fine-grained structure. So you may have just a couple of millimeters apart, an area that may be supporting language and an area that may be supporting complex reasoning, engaging, for example, mathematical performance. And the methods that people have used for many years before we introduced this individualized language mapping that you alluded to, is people would measure these responses in a whole bunch of individual brains and then kind of average brains together, which loses a lot of the fine-grained distinctions. And so you end up a very blurry picture, and oftentimes nearby areas would appear like one and the same, even though each individual, they're totally dissociated.
Got it. So you're helping to kind of see, like, get more fine-grained,
Exactly.
looking at which networks actually hang together in the brain functionally.
Yeah. That's what to do it is just by looking at individual brains. You can still draw population level inferences because we would still look at 10 or 20 or 30 brains for any given contrast, but all of the comparisons are performed in Garrett's brain and in Ev's brain and in somebody else's brain individually, so we can have as much resolution to tease things apart as possible.
Sure. Yeah, one task I remember that you're using, which is kind of a cool one to tease this apart, is that, using a different language to, or making the same stimulus but reversing it so you can listen to language, backward speech or something like that. So you're like getting sort of the same acoustic, perceptual acoustic information, but like that you're abstracting out the meaning portion. So Jennifer has a quick question about thinking, kind of the inner voice idea of, endophagia. When you talk to yourself, are you seeing the language network activated?
That's a great question. So the inner voice or inner speech phenomenon is not super well understood yet. I can tell you briefly what we know. So first of all, of course, if I have people perform what people refer to as covert production, right? Like I show you a picture and I say, can you generate a description, but don't say it out loud, just kind of generate it in your head. That kind of a task, of course, will engage language mechanisms because you're effectively generating a sequence of words. You're just not outputting them through your kind of
Hmm.
interface with the world, which is in this case, speaking or writing or something like that. But this more spontaneous engagement, if in what feels to some people like talking to yourself in your head, right? If you're like walking on the street and kind of thinking to yourself, and it feels like you're talking to yourself. So that phenomenon, first of all, does not appear to be universal across people. So about 20% of people don't have that phenomenological sensation of talking to themselves. So that already should tell you that engaging in this kind of self-speech cannot be critical to complex cognition, because certainly you don't want to claim that those 20% of people don't have complex cognition and ability to think, right? So it doesn't seem like it's critical. But to the extent that a lot of people do have that phenomenology, we and a few other groups are now really trying to understand what is that? Is this functionally helpful? Is it functionally helpful in the same or different way as, for example, externalizing certain ideas in a form of schematics, or writing down some notions to figure out like how an argument goes together or something like that. A former PhD student, Anya Ivanova, who is now at Georgia Tech, is trying to see whether individual differences in the strength of this percept of talking to yourself when you're doing nothing, right, when you're just lying there thinking in the scanner, whether that, with those differences and how strongly you feel that inner speech are actually predictive of how much your language regions may be engaged when you're engaging in this self-talk. And so hopefully soon we'll have a little more clarity on whether this kind of intuitive sensation even engages the same mechanisms as kind of understanding actual externally coming in language.
Yeah, that's so crazy because my inner voice is so strong that I would, I imagine I use it um, when I'm doing math or, all these different other tasks that you kind of show that, are dissociable from language activity, language network activity.
Yeah.
So it's sort of
But
interesting to know that I could be wrong.
yeah, that's right. I mean, and I think intuitions about thinking are just really hard. And there may be pieces of our kind of internal thinking that we convert into speech after the thinking is done,
Mm,
into a verbal format. But there's also kind of conceptual reasons for why natural language cannot be the medium of thinking itself, because the cost of accessing words from memory and combining them into well-formed structures, it's too slow. Based on what we know about the time course of those processes, it would
mhm.
make thinking prohibitively slow. Our thinking is way faster than what
Yeah.
we know about how long it takes to build a linguistic structure. And so
Hmm.
given how quickly we know some thinking happens, it already kind of makes it very unlikely that we're doing it through language. Even if in some cases, some individuals may later kind of, the thinking is happening in some latent space, and then they kind of convert it into a verbal form to maybe make it, to kind of concretize it or
Hmm.
offload it a little bit and help put pieces of arguments together or something like that.
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm going off track here, but this is
Okay.
just something that popped up in my head because I've heard you say before that you think of, the semantic meanings of words as like this storage idea as, these language centers are sort of pointing you to certain meanings of words, like they're pointers to meaning. But if the language system is modular and it's kind of happening really fast. And, like kind of LLMs are doing a pretty good job of doing this without accessing some extra meaning. I'm wondering how you think that works, or if it's a possibility that, something like simply the shape of moving through those different words in sort of this like next token prediction fashion it is something, has something to do with the meaning itself.
That's a great question. That's a very deep question, both about understanding artificial intelligence and understanding human language and semantic processing. So I do think that whatever is happening within the language system proper is a pretty shallow understanding of linguistic inputs. When you're saying LLMs, large language models are doing it, it depends on what it is, right? So
Hmm.
it's certainly the case that you can go a long way, as we've learned from these language models, based on just the statistical co-occurrence information about how words go together. this, in some sense, is not unexpected because, of course, if a species invents a communication system like humans did at some point, the structure of that communication system has to be able to reflect the internal states, our mind's content, because that's what we want to communicate to each other, right? Especially primates are highly social species. So if I have a lot to say, I'm thinking a lot of thinkings, and then I am trying to like share them with you, right? So I need some code that we can externalize. I can't telepathize, right? Humans haven't evolved to do that. So I have to somehow externalize it into a
Maybe one
format
day.
that maybe
Yeah.
one day exactly, that will allow you to understand what's in my mind, and then we can like connect socially and all that stuff, right? So it's not shocking that the structure of language will reflect a lot about the structure of the world, because that's how we use language. That's what it's for. It's for communicating information about the world and our thoughts about the world. Now, there is a deep ongoing debate about what it really means to understand, right? And there's a lot of arguments that real understanding involves some degree of embodiment of a system in the world, a system that has to have perceptual inputs and is able to interact with the world physically. There is other claims that certain aspects of reasoning, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the latter claims that certain aspects of reasoning cannot be taking place inside the language system. So for example, if I'm getting information about, say we have a shared acquaintance and you're telling me some piece of gossip about them, right? So of course I'm processing it initially through my language mechanisms. I have to, it's coming in a linguistic format, but then I have to like update my representation of that person and the social structure they're embedded in within my social knowledge. That kind of stuff will always be happening outside of the language system proper. So the way that we currently think about the language system itself is that it's a lexicalized parser. It's something that helps you understand very shallowly understand the structure of a sentence and understand kind of where we need to go in the brain to have this deeper understanding and to be able to subsequently reason on those representations or something like that. How the large language models map onto this remains an active area of research. We and other groups have shown that kind of early LLMs that are just trained on language, that are just doing language, they do a good job at capturing responses in the human language areas. So if I feed the same sentence to a model and to a human, the model can do a good job predicting at how the human language system will respond to that sentence. But of course, these days, LLMs have moved way beyond just linguistic processing, right? And beyond the next token prediction. So they're doing a lot of reasoning. They're trained with human-based reinforcement learning. They're trained on a lot of non-linguistic data, like huge databases of Python code and so on. So I think now how different pieces within these more complex, more recent LLMs map onto different pieces of the brain is a really exciting question. And we and many others are working on drawing these connections. But to go back to your basic question, I think a lot of kind of deeper contextualized, actionable understanding is happening outside the boundaries of this specialized language system.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think this point is so important, both that you can have the language system itself, like there's a lot outside of that that's happening. So you can kind of distinguish different types of thinking and networks from the linguistic system. And I think one thing that's, speech therapists will all know this, but there's, a lot of people that just know so much more than they can express linguistically. And then also, I think this can happen in a bunch of ways. Just because you say something doesn't mean you understand it as well.
That's
And
exactly
so,
right.
and yeah, so like you can even reason about something linguistically, based on this idea and not really understand what it means.
That's
So,
exactly right. I mean, we've all, taught sometimes, first year undergraduates in a certain class, they can verbatim kind of repeat back chunks of stuff that they've learned. But then if you probe things, if you're a good experimentalist, and that's what good teachers are, and you try to poke holes into like probing the underlying knowledge structures, it often kind of just tumbles down very quickly, right? Because they kind of learned how to talk about it in this very superficial way, but the deeper knowledge is not there yet.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And it's tough because just us humans, that's sort of our main way that we judge
Exactly.
intelligence.
Yeah, and it's often a good proxy, but it
Right,
can't associate. Yeah, yeah. We all, I mean,
right,
I'm
right.
sure, we all have some friends who we know are really, really bright. Sometimes they're like advanced mathematicians or, physicists or whatever, and they just have a real difficult time expressing themselves in words sometimes, and sometimes they're not great teachers for that reason, but they're obviously very, very smart. And similarly, I'm sure, some people here in the audience work with patients with aphasia. And it's, I know that in the SLP community, language of loss does not equal loss of intelligence. Loss of language does not equal loss of intelligence has kind of been,
Right.
slogan for many years. And yet, just because humans are so used to judging people's smarts by how they talk, then individuals who struggle with language are often judged to be less smart. And this applies not even just to aphasia, but people who stutter or people who have an accent, right? It's just
Hmm.
something that somehow humans do. It's probably a rational thing to do because in many cases, there is some correspondence there, but there's
Yeah.
obviously clear cases where those things don't go hand in hand. And I think being aware of that is really helpful to kind of dispelling a lot of these myths that it's kind of one and the same.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a good heuristic for sure. But
Mm.
yeah, I think at SLPs we work with all the edge cases. So
Yeah.
so I think part of our job too is advocacy in a sense. Show, because I'm sure that everyone here, all the attendees have worked with someone who um, uh, they know has so much more that they can express
Yeah.
and have difficulty in the linguistic aspect of that expression. So yeah.
Right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more because there's something that as a musician, I've talked to a lot of people that are sort of overlapping in neuroscience and music. So I've talked a lot with Professor Nina Kraus, who has this book of Sound Mind. She's a huge advocate for music as a sort of a super stimulus for auditory development, at least certain aspects of auditory processing. And she's done longitudinal work that has shown that music can be this skill that also is correlated with increases in reading scores and in other traditional language metrics. And I know you've kind of noted that there's this non-overlap between music
Right.
and language processing, and I wonder if there's I guess one, what you think about this, and then maybe two, if there's a possibility that simply just the help in like sort of the lower level speech perceptual processing aspects of sound with music, is there overlap there? And maybe is it like a scaffold um, for
Yeah.
language development?
Another very good question. I mean, so first of all, like in terms of the basic auditory processing, of course, all sounds are initially processed by the same circuits. Like in the cortex, it's primary auditory cortex. Any sound you hear, right? Speech, music, your cat meowing, whatever, all has to go through that station. And before it gets there from the outputs of our ears, there's also some subcortical structures that those signals go through before reaching the cortex. So initially, there's, of course, a shared path. Now, where things seem to differentiate is at the level of higher level auditory cortex. And this is beautiful work by Sam Norman Hagnier, who you might enjoy talking to at some point, where he was just interested in the overall structure of the auditory cortex. And he took this very nice approach where he probed responses to a broad array of natural sounds. They kind of just tried to comprehensively sample all the sounds that somebody might hear in their daily life, okay? And it's this broad array of sounds. And then they tried to understand how many shared components are there? What's the minimal kind of structure that we have in our auditory cortex that explains responses to all these diverse sounds? And it turns out that in terms of high level categories of sounds, there are these two specializations, one for speech sounds and one for music sounds.
Hmm.
okay, that exists. That finding has now been replicated across a few studies and by different groups. But so that's the areas that I was talking about that are really selective for the type of sound they process. So speech areas will respond to speech in both familiar and unfamiliar languages, but show very little response, to mechanical sounds, nature sounds, and music. And the music sounds show really strong responses to both vocal and instrumental music,
Hmm.
but not so much to any of the other categories. So there is already a split, and there's actually nice follow-up work on this using computational modeling, show that the kinds of demands that speech sounds versus music sounds pose makes that split happen even in artificial neural networks where there's no kind of biological evolutionary constraints, but something about the structure of that space of sounds makes it so that it's more efficient to have mechanisms that are separate. But another place where language or speech processing and music perception may overlap is within a very general system. So every human, and there's a very conserved system like macaques have it as well, there's a system that's very domain general, that is engaged by basically any kind of focused goal-directed behavior. So whenever you feel you're focusing, you're on task, that system is active. You can engage it very canonically by diverse, executive function tasks, right? So your standard working memory tasks, inhibitory control tasks, selection tasks, and so on. All of those tasks, no matter if they're on words or spatial configurations or visual images, all engage that system, suggesting that it supports some very general kind of computations. And that system has also been implicated in learning, dealing with new kinds of tasks. And a possible reason why we have this system is that it's kind of evolution's way to allow us to deal with changes in our environment. So on the one hand, it's really helpful to have specialized machinery, division of labor, a very useful concept. We've used it in human societies as well, right? Some people design rockets, other people treat patients of particular, right? So division of
Other
labor.
people study language network, brain
Exactly,
function.
for
Yeah.
example, yes. And so in the brain, it seems like that principle is also very, very much at work. But imagine if our environments suddenly change to be quite different and we have to deal with new kinds of challenges, right? It's very useful to leave some kind of flexible computational machinery that maybe can allow us to come up with solutions to these previously unencountered stimuli or computational demands. So that system, which, people call it the executive system or the multiple demand system, because it supports multiple kinds of cognitive demands, is a system that's engaged by basically any task that has some executive components. So sometimes you may find overlap between, say, a language task and a music task if they both have a working memory component, okay? If both of them require holding information active in memory, for example, then you may see overlap within that system. But that doesn't undermine the fact that when you're kind of naturally processing those domains, there is specialized systems for each of them. So
I
this is
see.
always
Okay.
to like recap, right? So there's like early processing that's obviously shared for the basic processing of sound. And then there may be some kind of extraneous task components that are often used when people get tested in these various domains, which will lead to apparent overlap, but the overlap is really very superficial. And I think there was a question in the chat about executive functions and language. I think that has led to a massive amount of confusion in the literature because people are using language assessments that have an executive component. And then they say, oh, look, performance on language tasks correlates or is predictive of performance on some executive function tasks.
I
But
see.
that's not because language shares machine with executive functions. It's because if language is tested in paradigms that have some executive components, it will draw on that executive component system. But most of the time we use language to communicate, those executive components are not there. And so I think that stuff has been deeply misguided. And I think a lot of, many millions of NIH dollars have been kind of spent not in optimal ways based on flawed inferences about that relationship.
It sounds like we have some work ahead of us then. I know there's some questions in the chat about what are the practical implications of both assessment and intervention with regards to what the brain research is showing. And I think there's still so much to be understood, right? If I'm getting that right, like it's because there are so many ways that we had previously thought that these things are the same, but now they're actually they're shown to be instantiated differently in the brain. So we kind of have work ahead of us as to
Right.
what exactly to do. Now, maybe just to talk a little bit about the earlier distinction we
Mhm.
made between speech and
Language.
these like higher level language
Yeah.
centers. It makes sense then that like appropriate diagnosis in the beginning would help guide the appropriate interventions, right? Because if you're working with Broca's aphasia patient and you think it's like a language-based disorder, like working on language structures isn't going to really help.
It's
You want
really
to
not.
focus on the speech motor stuff. So
Exactly.
you're doing
Right. That's
speech motor practice and motor planning, intervention practice.
yeah.
But with maybe a child who's you can probe their language system and understand that there's internal language structures aren't developing typically, then you want to focus more on language stuff. Or if they're not getting those early language concepts in terms of mapping, making symbolic mappings.
Yeah. 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 No,
Is
that's
it?
all exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important in both like diagnostics and treatments. Yeah, because in diagnostics you want to understand whether the deficit is a lower level deficit, in which case it should be specific to a particular modality. So specific, for example, to auditory perception, speech perception, or spoken motor planning. And to know whether it's a higher level or a lower level deficit, you want to use minimally different versions of tasks that compare processing across modalities and between comprehension and production as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for comparisons across modalities, it's also important to sometimes take the language piece out of it and use stimuli like non-words, right? Because
Mm.
if it's a motor speech planning problem, you should not only struggle to produce words, but also non-words that sound
Non-words.
like words, right? And similarly, if you can't perceive and hold on to a piece of speech, you should have similar troubles, regardless of whether it's meaningful speech or some, a bunch of like
Yeah.
not a real sentence or something like that. Anyway, so I think and many assessments that are pre-existing in both the developmental literature and the aphasia literature, they have some pieces of it there, but often not quite in the right form. Like they're often not minimally different, like they often differ in many ways, and then it's kind of hard to know um, if you can isolate the problem because many things differ, not just say the modality or not just the meaningfulness of the signal. And I think another really inherent difficulty, again, in both developmental and aphasia assessments, is that it's very hard to develop tasks that don't have an executive component. And so
Sure.
that's
Yeah.
just, I think that's just something to kind of keep in mind and try to, always include assessments of the executive functions outside of the context of language, and then kind of factor that out when you're trying to evaluate performance on language tasks. I mean, that's basically like this concept of G, right? Or general fluid intelligence that's, that has ample support back from Spearman 1909. There is a
Yeah.
component which we now think is supported by that executive system that I was talking about,
Mm.
which will contribute to performance on all tasks. But I think kind of understanding that that system is actually quite distinct from systems that support specialized information processing like language or face perception or music processing
Mm.
is important to keep in mind in thinking about this.
Sure. Yeah. Another really amazing finding that came out of your work was this the previously thought distinction between like semantics and syntax, like that there are these like clean lines between how we understand meanings of words and then have these rules that we use to put them together, that there's actually no clear cut distinctions between those in the brain. Like every time that we're processing semantics and then we're also processing syntax on some level and vice versa. And I mean, it's just another obvious example of how like our traditional assessments are, they're lacking in some ways because they have these clear distinctions. Here's a semantics, task. Here's a syntax task, and that's all we're testing. But it's like, I don't know about that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, so it's indeed the case that within this language network, there is no region level separation. It's not the case that one region accesses words from memory and another one puts them together into structured representations. And, we find this very strongly in the brain. Again, a bunch of groups have now replicated these findings, but that very intricate connection between words and syntax, evidence for that has been mounting from all sorts of directions for a long time now. Basically, as soon as, and so the core feature of one core feature of language is that you can't seem to, it's not enough to just know individual words and some really abstract rules like, oh, to make a sentence, you need a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Like that level of syntax is not particularly useful because it seems that across languages, the very particular words have a bunch of constraints on how they combine with other words. So that notion in theoretical linguistics is known as lexicalized syntax. So instead of these very abstract rules where you can, putatively plug in any noun phrase and a verb phrase and grammar will just, you'll have a grammatical sentence, it doesn't really work. And people who started building parsers in computational modeling work, natural language processing work back in the 80s, learned that very quickly, 70s and 80s, because they're like, okay, if you do these rules, you end up with a bunch of garbage, or the parsers are all incorrect. So you really have to
Yeah,
take into account particular lexical constraints. And so now actually
totally.
most accounts of language, even in diverse forms of linguistics, including the Chomskyan tradition, which was the one that initially separated syntax as like its own thing, it's now assuming this very lexicalized view of syntax, because I think evidence for that is kind of indisputable. And so taking all this into account, and of course, in language development, right? How many words is highly predictive of how well you can structure phrases and
Hmm.
sentences, right? You need some minimal number of words before you can start combining them into these little phrases like, 2-year-olds are starting to do, or 1.5-year-olds or whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the fact that the brain architecture mirrors these behavioral and kind of theoretical arguments, just observations about how language works, is nice. But again, I
Yeah.
think the fact that they are very strongly intertwined um, uh, has the evidence for that has been accumulating for many, many years from different directions. So that means that, you can, of course, have assessments that target your understanding of word meanings, right? Your vocabulary knowledge or your syntactic processing, but it's not like uh, you can operate by training, for example, developing interventions that work on one component or another, that you can affect independent components of the language system in the brain. No, that doesn't really work like that. They both kind of comprise core pieces of language, and they,
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
implementation, are implemented in this very integrated way.
I think for most of the SLPs in here, I've definitely seen this as like the teaching of these abstract grammatical rules
Mhm.
versus teaching in this naturalistic like context-based way. Like there's a clear difference
Yes,
in outcomes because you can have like someone who's like maybe they learned a grammar rule and they get spit it out, but they're not using language well in context, and then vice versa. It's like, and
exactly.
it's funny. Like I was I was trying to learn some, someone was teaching me some Gen Z slang the other day, and they're teaching me this word, like this phrase "no cap," which means like it's not a lie, but like I was using it totally wrong. I was
Yeah,
using it in this like very this way that was like, oh yeah, he told no cap, or
yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
and that, like, but you can't
No.
use those things that way. So it's kind of a funny example of how we
Language is
have actually really
contextualized. Yeah,
specific contextual ways that these
that's right.
words fall
That's
into
Well,
language.
that's what known as usage-based approaches to language, right? Like that's in contrast to kind of these, pure grammar stored somewhere. It's all about how language is used. And that again goes against all this prescriptivism, right? Like, oh, this is not grammatically correct. If the community is using something in a certain way, like
Yeah,
that's correct. Like
right.
usage determines what's a part of language or not. And yeah, anyway.
Yeah, it's like a consensus based. There's
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's one thing that I've definitely tried to emphasize on this podcast is like how important it is for like context based, like
Yeah.
sort of naturalistic interventions. One, just as we are sort of wrapping up, I also really want to talk to you because this is super interesting, but it seems like you've done some really cool work with atypical brains. So, for example, like lawyers and doctors that, like, maybe based on a brain scan, like someone would think they wouldn't be capable of doing very much of anything, but they're functioning totally
Right.
properly. And yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So we have this project where we study people with structurally very atypical brains. Like you look at their brain and it looks like something is really wrong, but they're all cognitively totally fine. And the reason, and typically, so there's many causes for the structural anomaly. By far the most common is cysts. So sometimes there's congenital cysts, which are, water-filled sacs, and sometimes they expand. And we have individuals who have their whole frontotemporal area may be taken up by a massive cyst, and the brain is kind of squashed and deformed around that water sac. Hydrocephalus is another version of that, right? Where sometimes the ventricles fill up with fluid and the brain is really squashed to the cortex. So there's these big deformities, not typical looking brains. And the questions that this population allows us to ask is basically, is there more than one way to build a human mind, right? Because the cognitive capacities of these individuals are perfectly intact, but they have to operate within this very structurally different space. And you can ask what constraints on the organization of that space are hard constraints, so that we look at these individuals and we find that the organization respects those constraints, and which constraints are more viable and soft, right? And so, for example, one good example for language folks is that language lateralization to the left hemisphere, which happens in 95, between 90 and 95% of individuals. It's a more dominant left hemisphere system. It's totally fine to have a system lateralized to the right and have typical language abilities. So that doesn't seem like a hard constraint. And we still, as a field, don't understand why in the majority of individuals it goes to the left. That, I would say, is a very big open question that remains. But we know that it's fine to have it lateralized to the right. And sometimes even in typical brains, individuals have right lateralized language systems, and they seem to be fine for all intents and purposes, okay? But something like specialization, right, modularity that we talked about, division of labor, where we have a separate system that deals with processing faces, and a separate system that deals with parsing linguistic strings, and a separate system for processing musical information or something like that, right? That, from our work so far, since a lot of it is work in progress, that seems to be preserved. So even if the brain is all deformed by a massive cyst, it seems that distinct regions continue to subserve different functions. It's not like it all kind of gets squashed and now you have overlapping areas that say deal with language and social perception or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of questions we're tackling in that project.
Very, very cool. That's so interesting. I'm so excited to see what comes out of this
Yeah.
research. I think you did mention too that sometimes, like in autism, in some cases, for example, language might be like bilaterally, more processed. Do you have speculation about why that might be the case?
Yeah, it seems like more bilateral language processing is actually present across quite a few developmental disorders, including disorders that don't have to do with language per se, like epilepsy and so on. But it's not clear whether there's going to be one single explanation for why that is the case, but it does seem to be the case that when something is going a little bit differently during early development, or sometimes a lot different, you end up with this more bilateral system.
Mhm.
There was a claim for a while that the language system starts out as a bilateral system at a young age.
Mm.
We now know that at least by age 3 to 4, the system is very left lateralized in the majority of kids. So it doesn't seem like there's this early bilateral system that becomes more left lateralized with age. That does
Mm.
not seem to hold. Whether it's more bilateral for early speech perception in infancy, and kind of maybe by age 1 and 2 ends up lateralized, we don't know.
Hard to test those.
Very hard to test the population, exactly. But why in these atypical populations with developmental disorders, you end up with a stronger role that the right hemisphere continues to play is a good question that many groups are working
Mm.
on different angles, working with different populations, trying to
Yeah,
understand that maladaptive contribution of the stronger continuing response in the right hemisphere.
it's so interesting. Yeah. Do you think it has anything to do with, so I may be getting this totally wrong, but I, when you're developing expertise in any task like juggling or, some task that is not, something that most humans do, it tends to be more of a whole brain at first, like whole brain activation, which then gets left lateralized and kind of moves backward, from what I understand. Is like as you gain expertise in that skill, is there might there be something in certain typically developing brains that has these sort of pre-wired, like pre-structured prior to experience ways of making language like more a bit different in other brains, might be like language might be a skill like juggling where it's like, they just have to kind of learn um, in this
Mhm.
particular way.
I'm not sure about the findings you're referring to with the like training. I mean, presumably if it's a bilateral like motor skill like juggling or playing the piano, presumably it wouldn't be strongly lateralized to one hemisphere, but maybe I don't know the relevant studies you're referring to. But
Yeah,
language is certainly a skill, right? I mean, there's no question that that's a skill, and
yeah,
every typically developing kid acquires this skill. Whether something is different going on in, say, individuals who choose to become polyglots or professional writers or, simultaneous translators, whether that's that kind of uptraining of the system in one way or another, whether it's kind of keeps doing more of the same or whether that's like a fundamentally different uptraining than whatever is happening during the early language learning, I don't think we know yet. But uh, like I said, I mean, in terms of at least in typically developing kids by about age, 3 to 4, the language system topographically, in terms of its like basic layout, looks very much adult-like. The
yeah.
pieces are there. It responds a lot less to language. So the response to language, the level of response increases as you grow and presumably improve your linguistic ability. And you find a similar increase actually if you take an adult. So you might think that maybe this increasing response is due to something like biological brain maturation. And that doesn't seem to be the case because in adults, if I, for example, image you right now, responding to some unfamiliar language, and then you start learning this language, and I measure your brain's responses to that language over time, you will find that the responses will increase as you become more proficient.
Hmm.
Again, tying back to this conceptualization of this language system as a store of language knowledge. Presumably, the more you can get out of the input and the better you can convert your thoughts into word sequences, the more you're using that system, right?
I see.
Imagine like, if you're just starting to learn a language, you're listening to somebody speak and you occasionally like catch a word or a phrase, right? And that
Yeah,
results in some neural activity. But when you become proficient, all of it is understandable, right? So you can access each word, build all of the syntactic structure. So that's more neural activity. And so I think that's what underlies the developmental increase in the level
hmm,
of response to language, the same as increase in L2 second language learning in adulthood, for example.
very cool. So just as we wrap up, there's just one or two more questions, but Kim is asking about if you know anything about dyslexia in the brain, um, and how that might be differentially instantiated. If
I mean,
not,
so
that's
there's
fine.
certainly a lot of claims of structural differences, like microstructural differences, like patterns of connectivity or thickness of certain brain areas. I don't really work on dyslexia, so I don't know what the latest consensus may be there, but people certainly have reported what look like structural differences between dyslexics and typically reading kids.
Got it. I guess as we wrap up, what are your most, the things that you're working on, or what are you most excited about nowadays?
I'm excited about many things. So we're doing a lot of work on the development of the language system right now. Like, where does the system come from, right? We know it becomes specialized for language, as early as we can measure, but those regions are there from birth. What are they doing? What do they respond to when a kid hears speech from early on, right? But that can't understand speech yet. Do these regions respond to kind of any social communicative signal? Do they respond to just meaningful information in the world? Like, what are language circuits made of? And so we're trying to do this is with Haley Olson, who is a postdoc in the lab. We're trying to do this by longitudinally scanning infants and then later testing them once they have the language system developed, and trying to kind of retroactively look back at their early responses in infancy and see what those regions are responsive to. So that's fun and ambitious and incredibly challenging, but hopefully we'll get some answers there. And I think, one other thing I think is really, really exciting and important is the advances that happened in AI. Until just a few years ago, and a lot of us here, well, I don't know what the age range of your audience is, but I certainly grew up in my undergraduate education being told that only the human brain is capable of language. Well, that's obviously not true, right? We have these language models that are performing this behavior that we all have been studying, and that's an incredible advance. And people just kind of quickly oh, well, of course these models can learn language. This is kind of like, whatever, but they can't think or something like this. And I'm like, well, let's just take a little pause and appreciate the fact that we finally have a model organism that you can probe in every which way that can do the behavior that we're also interested in, and try to understand whether some aspects of how these models do language is similar to or different from how humans may learn, represent, and process language. So I think there's a lot of really cool work to do trying to use these as like an in silico model organism, much like, vision scientists are using mice or other animal models. This is just not a biological model, but it's a model that you can do all sorts of things that you can't do with a human brain. And so I think that's a really exciting new tool that can lead to a lot of interesting advances.
It's fantastic. Yeah, it's such an exciting time to be in this field of language and just, yeah. And thank you again. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
thanks for your questions.
Absolutely.
Follow up. I can point you, for interest in dyslexia, I can point you to researchers who are kind of at the cutting edge of the field or whatever. And feel free to follow up with questions. I'm always happy to engage with the SLP community.
Great. Yeah, you're such an inspiration. Thank you for revealing this aspect of the mystery that is language. So, I guess any last remarks or conclusions you'd like to leave us with?
Thank you guys for what you do. I mean, you're really doing the actual hard work of helping people either regain function or try to develop language in cases where it's difficult. So as a language scientist and as a human, I really appreciate all your guys' hard work. So thank you.
Thank you for those kind words. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Beyond Words, for giving your incredibly valuable time and attention. If you found this interesting, inspiring, valuable to your practice, I'd be so grateful if you just took a moment to like and subscribe, leave a review. I'll definitely read it. I would love to hear from you. And these small actions, they just really make a big difference to help me creating these meaningful conversations at this intersection of science and speech therapy and human connection. So until next time, take care. And thanks again for going beyond the words with me.